Our next speaker is Andy Leidolf, who is a PhD candidate in ecology at the here in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State. And he's working with John Bissonette on a mega-analysis of effects on fire on avian population. Andy is a native of Germany and holds a BS degree in forestry and wildlife management from Mississippi State and a master's in fisheries and wildlife ecology from here at Utah State. His research interests are primarily in avian ecology and conservation, as well as population and community ecology, specifically the response of animals to large-scale disturbances. Andy just recently accepted a tenured track appointment as assistant professor of biology and environmental science at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Andy will be talking to us about wildlife issues related to aspen decline and restoration. Andy?
All right, well, it occurred to me, and I use this term with a lot of respect, but if Dale and Wayne are aspen geezers, I guess that would make me an aspen toddler. I've come to aspen ecology and management fairly recently, and one of the reasons for that is, and it's already been brought up by some of the previous speakers, is that right now at Utah State we actually have a fairly exciting and very productive environment for aspen research with I think Ron mentioned that 15 plus faculty members involved, with a large cohort of grad students that are involved in aspen research, and it's just a very exciting time to be here at Utah State for these things. Of course, after I got involved I had to leave, but I do enjoy coming back, and I appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. Whenever we look at issues that deal with things like vegetation changes in the western United States, whether we're talking about juniper encroachment in sagebrush, or we're talking about degradation of sagebrush steppe through cheatgrass invasion, we think of these things as issues, and what makes it issues is that we end up getting a number of different resources that are affected, that each have their own stakeholders that care about them, that each have their own land managers and resource users and scientists that are affected by it. What makes this project so exciting is that it is a truly interdisciplinary and integrative project that actually looks at many of these things simultaneously already at this time. We just heard about Helga's research, and Ron talked about water relations. We're going to hear later from Karen Mock about genetic diversity. What brought me on board was when Ron basically approached me and said, well, why don't we add something about wildlife to this? We're really lacking an integrative wildlife component. We've heard from Dr. Kay about research that he does with ungulates, more sort of taking a historical approach. What we wanted to do is look at it more from a community level, and that's what I want to talk to you about here today. The study was conceived about a year after Ron started his research with water relations, so I don't have many results to show you. What I do want to take you through is the thought process that got us to where we are, and the way this last year sort of changed the way I think about aspen, not having had many preconceived notions coming into the research. So that's what I want to spend a little bit of time doing today. You might ask, well, why do we want to study the effects that aspen decline and restoration might have on wildlife? And there's obviously a number of reasons, and I just threw a couple up here. We always hear about the importance that aspen has to both local and regional wildlife diversity. It's actually very difficult with the literature research I've been doing over the past year to find good statistics on that. There are some numbers out there. In Wyoming, we have about 140 species of birds and mammals that use aspen habitat. But you would think that as much as this is sort of thrown around as a notion, that we would have much better statistics on just what the relevance of aspen is to biodiversity. So that's one thing, from my perspective, I'm really not convinced that is not necessarily the case. But I'm eager to find out just exactly what aspen contributes to wildlife biodiversity. We do know that wildlife in general can have an important impact on community structure and ecosystem function. And one example that Dr. Kay talked about very eloquently are trophic cascades that can be initiated through predator introduction. Now, whether it's going to make a difference in aspen restoration, that's another story, but we certainly see those effects that trickle down through food chains. We have, of course, critters that have economic importance, whether these are consumptive or non-consumptive uses, things like elk and ruffed grouse, and people that like to go bird watching in Aspen and so forth, bringing a lot of money to the states that have Aspen systems. And then there are legal and ethical mandates. Those include wildlife legislation that deals with threatened and endangered species, the idea that we're managing systems for multiple use. And also this idea, and this goes back to Aldo Leopold, of an existence value, that even if it's something that we may not put an economic value on, we tend to care about it just because we know that it's there. So that you can think of that as sort of more of an ethical consideration. I just wanted to throw this in here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time about it because Dr. Kay's already talked about it, but just to give you an example of where wildlife can have a fairly dramatic effect is this system where we're looking at elk and their effect on aspen and willow. And we also have some lateral, some ancillary components here, such as songbird communities, which depend on aspen for habitat and also as a resource for insects. And of course beaver on the other side, which feeds on willows and also aspen. I should have put another arrow there, but I wanted to keep it fairly simple. What this is basically a representation of what this looked like before the introduction of wolves. And we see that we see this sort of cascading effect where all of a sudden things tend to become a lot more complicated, and we get these what we call second order interactions, where all of a sudden, through the introduction of a top predator, we see some beneficial effects at some lower levels in this trophic structure, such as aspen and willow receiving less pressure from native ungulates, and that having a positive feedback onto things like songbirds and beaver. So that just as a sort of a quick example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the importance of wildlife. One thing that I really like about the two papers that this came out of is, and Bailey and Whitham make this point very well, is that we tend to think about things as bottom up and top down, and where a lot of that comes from is sort of that classic HSS trophic cascade theory, where we tend to think about food chains. But in reality, when we take a systems perspective, there's usually both bottom up and top down, and there tend to be a lot of lateral relations that are going on. And I think this graph, again, if you're woozy from looking at it, I think it kind of gets that point across. That there is a lot going on. We don't have to look at complex interactions at these trophic cascades and whatnot to see how different resources are interrelated. Even if we just take a very simple idea of understory vegetation in aspen and how that relates to wildlife, those are not two things that are independently affected by what we do in aspen or what is going on in the landscape that we may try to reverse. We also have some connections that are taking place, either direct, where we have understory vegetation serving as a food source to wildlife. We may have wildlife playing a role in the dispersal of understory vegetation through seed dispersal. And then we have some indirect interactions, such as through nest sites for birds or through insects as a food source. And so we don't have to get all complicated to see what some of these interrelations are and where wildlife can really fit in with some of these other concerns that some of you guys may have. As you may by now have appreciated, is I come at this kind of from an avian perspective, and one of the reasons might be that we've already heard a lot about native ungulates today, but really what I like to do is to look at things from a community perspective, because I feel that I get a lot of integration at this level, because I'm looking at a number of different organisms simultaneously, and I get to look at their interactions at the same time. The reason I think birds are a very good study organism is because they tend to be very sensitive to spatiotemporal changes in the environment. They have relatively long lifespans, considering. They have low birth rates. And so things that are going on in the environment, both on a spatial and temporal scale, tend to really affect them. We also tend to think of birds as indicators of ecosystem integrity, because they tend to use a variety of resources simultaneously. Which makes them great integrators of ecosystem processes and changes that we may see as a result of either natural or human-caused processes. The other thing is that they're fairly easy to monitor, and that's something where you could probably make the same argument for small mammals and so forth, but there you're dealing with a very different issue in terms of monitoring. Both logistic and financial and so forth. Birds, on the other end, especially passerine songbirds that tend to be territorial, that tend to sing, are fairly easily monitored. We've been doing it for a long time, so we have protocols that are well established, and they're easily replicated. And so that makes them really a good species to sort of carry across systems and across different research efforts to then hopefully arrive at some synthesis of what's occurring on the landscape. So what I want to spend a little bit of time on is just, what do we know? Again, I don't have many results from the work that Ron and I have just started, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about what do we know about birds in the montane Intermountain West in general, and possibly in Aspen and conifer in particular. And I think the first thing that I'd like to point out there is that vegetation structure matters, and so does composition. This is something that comes as no surprise. We know from MacArthur, from Wilson, from Carr, from all these people back in the 60s and 70s that have looked at these things, that structure is tremendously important to birds. And so is floristic composition because of the unique resources that it can provide. In Aspen and conifer in the Intermountain West in general, we do have some indications that is true. That aspen isn't aspen to a bird, because we have some studies where people have looked at the species composition of birds and different types of aspen, and have found that variation can be tremendous in the absence of fire, for example. We do also see that aspen stands tend to have higher bird species richness than we find in very simple conifer communities. Ponderosa pine is a good example. There's a number of studies that have looked at that and have found significantly higher bird species richness in aspen stands. The one thing I'd like to point out here, though, is that we do have structurally complex conifer communities. There's not much, conifer forest primeval necessarily left, but if you look at some secondary old growth of spruce fir, those tend to be structurally quite complex. And so whenever we look at sort of comparative studies of aspen and these sort of conifer stands, we tend to find that they can be quite similar with respect to species richness and species diversity. So that just as a little cautionary note. One thing that I'm becoming more and more interested in is the fact that, and probably having done my PhD, or still continuing to do it with a landscape ecologist, is the fact that landscape context matters a lot. We know that woodpeckers are a great example of this because they tend to nest preferentially in aspen, but their foraging areas are generally in conifer. And so if you're going to maintain a viable population of these birds on the landscape, you're going to have to provide for both of those needs. And we see that not just in montane aspen, we see that in other parts of the country as well. In the southeast, we have red-cockaded woodpeckers, and there it's actually reversed, where we have the nesting habitat in the conifers and the feeding habitat in the mixed pine hardwoods. And so it's a very common phenomenon, but it's something that is frequently not acknowledged because many people are sort of having a hard time coming to terms with how to describe landscape structure and interspersion of habitat. Another example, and this is something that Ron and I have found just in our work at Deseret, is that when we look at species like lazuli bunting and green-tailed towhee, in aspen stands that are interspersed with open shrub-dominated meadows, they go through the roof. We have very high abundances of these species because they're responding to that resource. And so again, here we have a situation where the landscape context is tremendously important. One thing that I've kind of thrown in there, I haven't got any data on it because I haven't collected year-round data yet, and there's nothing in the literature that I'm aware of, but what about resident species? If we think about the differences that Ron's talked about in his talk, in thermal properties that we can see between aspen and conifer, the fact that in conifers we have this sort of dark body kind of effect. We have obviously an evergreen plant compared to a deciduous plant. It would make sense to think that birds that are faced with challenges regarding thermoregulation and so forth in the wintertime are probably going to have to make a decision about where they're going to put up camp for the winter. And this is really intuitive to me because I've seen this from my past work that I've conducted in Gamble Oak, where we see this very pronounced, where we have basically the entire resident Gamble Oak community move into adjacent pinyon juniper during the wintertime. So this is definitely something that I think kind of fits into this idea of landscape context. And then finally, and this is probably the most important point, and I can't stress it enough, is that cavities really matter. I mean, if we look at aspen communities, they're structured by what Griffiths, Kyle, and Beyer have termed nest webs. So kind of analogous to the idea of a food web. The fact that within the community here, of course, these songbirds aren't eating each other. They may be competing for similar resources, but they're interacting through another resource, which is nests, because we have basically guilds of cavity producers, which include our strong and weak primary cavity nesters. And then also we have the cavity consumers, which are secondary cavity nesters, the birds that are unable to excavate their own cavity and therefore rely on cavities that have been provided by primary cavity nesters. And there's just a tremendous amount of information from the Intermountain West from Wyoming and Arizona and Colorado and up into British Columbia, of just looking at the important role that Aspen plays in providing these cavities, the rates of reuse that we see in Aspen, the preference that a lot of species seem to express for cavities in Aspen. Williamson sapsucker is a good example of that. So this is definitely something that when you're looking at avian community dynamics in montane aspen is going to be something that is going to play a central role. And it's something that we clearly need to think about when we think about management of these resources. So what do we know about how birds respond to these vegetation changes in the Intermountain West? And the short of that, the skinny, is that the information is very sparse. Now, we can use our knowledge of what matters to birds in the montane Intermountain West, which I've just kind of gone through in the last previous slides, to kind of predict what we think some of these responses might be, but that entails knowing what the effects of treatments are going to be, and that's something that we don't always know. One thing that we're going to be looking at pretty soon with this paired watershed study is to try to get a feel for what different vegetation treatments are going to do to things like understory vegetation, which we just talked about as being an important determinant of avian community structure. So unless we can predict what the effects of treatments are, even our knowledge of what birds like and what birds care about in montane aspen isn't necessarily going to get us those answers. And even if we did, we really don't have any direct evidence for any of these predictions. There's not a lot of information out there. And so that's a bit problematic. Well, one way to look at this is, and this is something that I've tried to do, is to kind of try to draw some lessons from the boreal forest, because the boreal forest has a much longer history of avian ecological studies. And in the boreal forest, we've really progressed beyond just the sort of gee whiz, look what we found stage, which is still what we have a lot in the montane aspen, and sort of gone into the more synthetic and also sort of the management experiment type stage, where people are looking at or have been looking at the effects of different harvest treatments, looking at different age classes of aspen and how that relates to some of these relevant parameters. And so generally what we found here is that bird species richness increases with aspen stand age, and this is due to the fact primarily that we're gaining canopy nesting and cavity nesting birds. So again, that importance of cavities for the dynamics in the system. Generally, we find greater richness and also greater total abundance in mixed wood systems than we do either in pure aspen or in pure conifer. And this is primarily due to the conifer component. When we look at mixed wood systems that are dominated by aspen or conifer, we tend to see that difference there, that really the conifer component seems to be what's driving that. But there's also some evidence of synergy, the fact that some of these mixed wood systems may be more than the sum of their respective aspen and conifer parts. So that's, I think, is another very interesting phenomenon that we're going to be trying to look at in our research as well. When we get the same kind of results. We look at harvest. When we look at harvest in boreal mixed woods, we generally get decreased species richness, decreased total abundance, but that gets dampened quite a bit as we move from complete clear cuts to partial cuts. I think the cutoff is something like 40%, where we're really starting to see a dampening of that effect. And in general, if we look at aspen sort of as a serial component all the way into the old growth aspen that is then slowly replaced by conifers, we tend to see that the conifer associated species are starting to become much more prominent in that old growth aspen. So again, the influence of the conifer kind of acting. Now, what little I know at this point, and this comes primarily from two studies by Scott and Crouch in Colorado and the work that Ron and I have done, it supports these observations to a T. I mean, it is definitely from that perspective, we can probably use the boreal forest as a model of what we might expect to happen in montane aspen in the Intermountain West once we start implementing some of these treatments. So what I want to kind of leave you with is, first of all, what I feel are some implications for what we might need to be looking at. What are some future directions where this research could take us? And I think, first of all, we need to think about identifying structural and compositional elements of aspen that have the potential to profoundly affect avian communities. In other words, what are those structural elements? What are the thresholds that are going to give us substantial differences as we move across the aspen landscape? I think we need to look at the spatial relationships between aspen and conifer, and we need to do this at multiple spatial scales. Again, this idea of the landscape context, but also from a perspective of heterogeneity and the idea of conifer encroachment in aspen, People have looked at, what does it take for an aspen stand to show a difference in avian community composition with respect to conifers moving in. And generally, one or two or three conifers coming in as individual trees is not going to cause the same kind of effect that we see when we see sort of a massive front of conifer slowly encroaching on an aspen stand. So I think we need to look at these kind of relationships. And I think finally, because of what people have noticed in the boreal forest, that a lot of these mixed wood communities tend to be a lot more species diverse, and that there is synergy in these communities, I think we need to look at the role that these integrated communities play on that landscape that we're looking to manage. I think we need to think about what those integrated communities contribute to both the local and the regional species diversity. We need to think about that in terms of what our conservation priorities are. And I think we need to try to get a handle on the extent that of synergy that's taking place, and whether it is synergy or whether it is maybe simply additivity or what I've called here compensation. Another way you might want to look at that is an idea of reverse synergy, where we may actually see a decrease in these mixed communities, maybe because of some changes due to conifer encroachment. One example that I can think of is people have found that a lot of species tend to have higher nest success in aspen trees that are surrounded by a certain perimeter of aspen, and that nest success was negatively correlated to the distance to conifer. And so if we have encroachment, we may actually see a reverse synergy that results in certain species dropping out of that community due to maybe lowered nest success, or at least that system becoming a sink for some of these species. And I think we need to gain a better understanding of what cavity formation, longevity, occupancy, nest success, and reuse is like in these communities, and what the relationship between primary and secondary cavity nesters is. Again, there's a lot of work on this in the boreal forest where people have looked at, do there seem to be certain symbiotic relationships where certain secondary nesters tend to prefer cavities excavated by certain primary cavity nesters. And I think these are some things that I'm tremendously curious about, that I would like to gain a lot more understanding of in our systems here. Now, this is sort of a little bit of a postscript, and these are, one way you can want to think of it as maybe as sort of some musings. And again, it's sort of a little bit out of the naivete that I have as, talking about aspen ecology and management, because I am, again, a toddler in this field. But I'm kind of curious, can we use wildlife to some extent to give us some perspective on what some relevant aspen types might be? I mean, we look at classifications like Mugler, where he tries to give us different types of aspen that we can classify on the landscape based on certain understory characteristics and various other things, structural characteristics. Can we use wildlife to tell us some of that? Can we go and collect data on a large spatial scale that we then use some ordination or other technique to give us an idea of what the groups are that are breaking out? And is that something that could have a relevance that would extend beyond just looking at avian communities? What has come out of some late night discussions after way too many beers between Ron and me is the idea that just what are mechanisms that have allowed aspen to persist in the Intermountain West. And where that gets us is this idea of the purple martin that we're having a really hard time coming to terms with. Purple martin is a secondary cavity nester. It is a colonial species, and it's a fairly good-sized bird, which means that it nests in fairly large diameter cavity-bearing trees. Now, for an aspen tree to get to that size takes time. They're having to first be a primary cavity nester that has to excavate that cavity for a purple martin to then be able to colonize takes time. For purple martins to develop a sustaining colony that starts maybe with a single pair that is then slowly supplemented by siblings that may be returning to the same site, that takes time. And for that colony to become persistent in the landscape takes time. What I'm left with there is something that I have a hard time explaining when I look at what some people think maybe sort of the natural fire return interval in aspen, and the idea that maybe what has allowed historically aspen to persist in the Intermountain West is fire. Because when you look at a species like the purple martin, I mean, everything just says, I need time, I need more time. And that makes me really kind of curious about whether when we look at montane aspen in the Intermountain West, we may be seeing a combination of both cereal and persistent aspen. And what that makes me wonder is what are the mechanisms that allow that aspen to persist. And again, I think Dr. Kay has sort of alluded to some of these issues. So again, take these sort of with a grain of salt, just sort of as musings from a toddler in Aspen research. But there's sort of things that are going around in my head right now. Again, this is obviously a huge slide, and all I wanted to put this up for is just to show you this is sort of our map for the research that we hope to be conducting over the next couple of years. We would really like to take various levels of ecological integration and ask some very specific questions about what is going on in that landscape with respect to avian communities. With both spatial and temporal explicitness, looking at multiple spatial scales simultaneously, looking over fairly long temporal scales, and looking beyond just presence and abundance of species, but also at productivity to get at more relevant measures of population success over time. So that's something, if any of you have questions about this, I would love to spend more time talking to you about, but obviously I'm out of time. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Yeah, Paul.
I'd just like to sort of lose the idea of time, but maybe miss the idea relating to the first talk today of specific pathogens that facilitate these nesting birds.
It's actually, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the cankers and stuff that develop in the older age aspens, really that's a key element in ongoing development of bird habitat.
Yeah. There's actually, the answer to that is sort of twofold. One is that when we look at primary cavity nesters, we tend to distinguish between strong excavators and weak excavators. The strong excavators generally are able to attack what could be a healthy tree. The weak excavators generally need a tree that already has some kind of heart rot going on, that is already decaying on some level, and that includes things like red-breasted nuthatch or chickadees to some extent, and Tom Edwards here at USU and Josh Lawler have done some more looking at those sort of things. As far as the strong excavators goes, there is research that indicates that they're able to select both trees that differ significantly from surrounding trees and trees selected at random within the stand that have significantly lower penetration strength than random or surrounding trees. And within the tree that they finally select for a cavity, they are also able to select a portion of the tree that has significantly lower strength related to other parts of that same tree. So somehow, and I don't know whether they just kind of hop around the tree and kind of tap at it to kind of get a feel for what's in store for them, but they have a way of doing that. And certainly, from the perspective of weak excavators, these pathogens would be of tremendous importance. So that's a good point. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks for your attention.